Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to a new episode of the Art Business Podcast. My name is David Bellingham. I'm Programme Director of the Masters of Art Business in Sotheby's Institute of Art in London. And my guest today has had some connections with the Institute. I think she did a course there. We'll hear about that later. Her name's Dee Haughney. That is pronounced apparently like the artist David Haughney, but it's an Irish name, and we'll no doubt hear more about Dee's Irish heritage during the podcast. So you're very welcome, Dee.
Thank you, Dave. Great to chat.
And as usual, I'm going to start by asking, whether you have some kind of favourite urban centre and what the reasons for that might be.
Sure. Yeah, city-wise, definitely Cape Town is my favourite city. I spent a lot of time there, both personal and with work, travelling a lot to Cape Town Art Fair, and it's really got a little special place in my heart, particularly for the art scene to start with. Zeitz-MoCA has been a really great institution. I've done a lot of work there. Installed a great work by Anatsui there in 2019, so got to spend a lot of time, but also the other art centres and galleries around, like Norval Foundation and Stevenson Gallery, and yeah, it just has a real place in my heart for the art scene, but also because it's this beautiful city that's on the coast and has mountains beside it too, so it definitely just has a great vibe as a city. It's got, that underlying art scene and culture, which I love. So Cape Town is my go-to city, yeah.
Tremendous, yeah. And I think my first podcast was actually an alumnus called Craig Brown, who came from, he came from Johannesburg, from South Africa. But he did his dissertation on South African arts world and art markets, which was really, really interesting. I still actually send students to it sometimes if they want to do a dissertation on Africa. And I know, I've never been to South Africa. One of my sisters lives there, and for some reason never got there. But she's always sending photographs in the kind of what I see as a kind of outback. Barbecues and sort of dangerous situations with elephants with a Range Rover. Is your favourite like non-urban location in South Africa, or would that be somewhere else?
There is lots of places. Yeah, I did a lot of cycling through Africa, so a lot of non-urban spaces would be Africa. But I think my favourite would have to go back to my homeland and probably the island of Inishmore, which is in the Aran Islands, is the most spectacular kind of country place I could imagine. And I think a lot of people might know it most recently for being part of the film location for the Banshees of Inisherin, actually. But it's a beautiful space. Outside of that, it's got this incredible kind of natural, but almost looks man-made pool called Pulna Pest, and it's a diving space and a swimming space, and it's got loads of lovely cycling roads and horses. Yeah, so Inishmore would definitely be my go-to countryside location, despite lots of other beautiful places I've been lucky enough to be in. Yeah,
and there seems to be a general theme running through your bio of loving the sea and being by the sea, and of course the Delaware Pavilion. For listeners who don't know it, we'll be talking about it more later, obviously, but one of the spectacular things about that is its seaside setting on the south coast of England. So we'll talk about that later, perhaps, as well.
Sure.
So Dee, moving on from that, do you like buildings? Do you like architecture? Is there a building that you particularly love?
Yeah, one of my great friends is an architect, so I kind of have become a bit more obsessed with architecture since he's been studying and graduating. But I'm more interested in kind of ancient architecture, I suppose. The building that kind of has left most of an impact on me in kind of almost a spiritual way, for fear of going down that route, but is the Church of St. George in Lalibela in Ethiopia. So the rock-hewn churches that are built in the ground. So spectacular from the outside because you can't see them. They're completely like camouflaged by being underneath the ground and being carved out of the rock. But also when you enter it, it's this huge, big rock church, which has incredible acoustics. And when I visited, I was lucky enough to witness a ceremony that was kind of in the run-up to Easter in the Christian Orthodox churches in Ethiopia, which had a lot of singing, and yeah, it's a spectacular building. So if anyone is ever in Ethiopia, they're incredible to visit. They're complete works of art, sculptures dug into the ground, incredible. Yeah.
And when they're singing, what are the acoustics like if you're underground?
Incredible. So there's lots of like kind of almost like little channels and little tunnels that lead into this one central kind of atrium. And the singing in the atrium then reverberates through these little tunnels where people are praying. They kind of sit almost in the rocks as they're praying and kneeling. And it kind of echoes all around. It's just incredible. And yeah, it's a really, really interesting building to be in. Yeah.
Does anyone have any theories as why they are underground? Was it, you think, is this for safety, or is it that it's the only way they could actually build a church because they couldn't build it above ground because there wasn't the building material?
It was definitely for safety and to not show that they were worshipping there. So,
so what was the? There was
look at the landscape, and it completely just camouflaged that was actually happening. So yeah, it was purposely done, let's say. But I read a lot about it before I actually visited, but I never imagined the scale of what they were, because you almost think they're these cave churches, and maybe the pictures inside of them being quite low, but then. And the Church of St. George is made in a cross shape, so it kind of looks like little hedgerows on the hill, and then as you approach, it just goes right down. It's all, I don't know. It's like a cathedral, as we would imagine here in the UK. That scale, but really completely underground, which is incredible. Yeah.
That's incredible. I'll tell you what it reminds me of when I took a group to modern country Tunisia in North Africa, which has the reason I took them was for the Roman archaeology. The Romans were there, and one of the cities there is very similar. I think it's Bulla Regia, and all of the kind of villas and houses there were built into the rock underground. So you've got these curious situation of a typical kind of Roman house, like even with like a courtyard, but it's all underground. It's really
yeah. There you go. Yeah.
and then music. I mean. Does music play a role in your life? I'm thinking, as you're from Ireland, obviously,
exactly.
Irish music. Or maybe that's a bit of a stereotypical cliche.
I mean, it's a bit of cliche, but it's definitely true. So I can't escape it. I mean, I'm definitely more visual person. Visual arts comes first for me, but music is definitely embedded in me. I play the Barnor, which is the Irish drum. So lots of sessions when I'm back home always happen. And then probably my favorite kind of band at the moment is called the Gloaming, which is a mix of Irish and US musicians. So it's really mixing Irish folk music with contemporary music, which is
I've listened to some of that actually on Spotify. It's amazing. I remember when I was at university, this is going to give my age away, but I was into very sort of like progressive music, like Pink Floyd and Yes, and suddenly punk came, and it suddenly became very unfashionable. It just put the whole thing out. So I then got into like Irish folk music. I was at Birmingham in the university. It was fantastic. Not just Irish, English music as well. And then I went to, I got so into Irish music scene that I went to Dublin, and you might, I don't know how well you know London and that culture, but there's a pub called the Half Moon in Putney.
Yeah.
And they do these live gigs, and I remember seeing Moving Hearts that will be.
Oh my God!
Wow. I remember seeing them the whole week when they were there, and they recorded a live.
Oh wow, that's quite special, actually.
Yeah, and for the benefit of the listeners, this was arguably the first time that an Irish band had fused jazz, traditional folk music. So they had uilleann pipes and Baron, which is the drum play. They had a saxophonist, and they had a kind of guitarist. They had Donald Lunny, and that was amazing. So I guess both of us are saying what a vibrant culture Ireland is in all aspects of the arts. And I seem to remember that Dublin, I don't know if it still has this status, but am I right in saying that artists, if you can prove you're an artist of any kind, you get some kind of tax allowance?
Yeah, it's still quite. I mean, Dublin is such an expensive city now, but it still has that kind of that help for artists, which is really great. You get allowances, you get even support, I believe, in housing, and there's just such amazing grants available all the time as well. So it still tries to hold on to its heritage of supporting artists and being a place of like poets and painters and things like that.
Well, any listeners who've never been to Dublin, you should not just go there for the art gallery and so on. You should definitely go and go to one of the pubs one night and you'll just find that there are these informal sessions. As Dee says, if you can play an instrument, she plays the baron, the drum. You just join in and sit in the corner, and there's a fiddler, and it's great. It's a great crack, as they say.
Great crack, it really is. Yeah, exactly.
Now, I think that they used to have a really excellent music paper called Hot Press.
Yeah, Hot Press is still amazing and going. Yeah.
And I used to get it sent to me in London.
Oh.
And one day I was reading, and there was this little thing saying amazing new rock band hits Dublin, and it's this band called U2. And and then they came to London, and I went to the Hammersmith Palais, which is a relatively small venue. I'm not certain it was the first time, and I saw them there. Wow, and so I got back into a new kind of rock music, which was linked to the traditional music. So it's just interesting the way that one's following of with visual culture, which we'll talk more about, obviously. And I know the Delaware Pavilion that you'll talk about, that is kind of quite multicultural in all senses. So it has music and theatre and drama and all sorts of things going on, not only an art gallery, as it were. So moving from music, can you remember, do you have any early memories of like suddenly realizing there was this thing called art?
It's an unusual question. I'm trying to always think of, like, if there was one catalyst that got me on that. But I think from an early age, and maybe like 11, 12, I kind of got it into my head that I wanted to be a photographer. But I didn't come from a family that were into the arts, or we were going to art galleries or anything like that. I was in a very, very rural location, grew up on a farm. My mother was a teacher, my dad was a farmer. But definitely there was always creativity in our family. My dad makes a lot of things in metalwork and woodwork. And my mom, which I'll kind of go into, which kind of got me interested in contemporary art from Africa, had spent a lot of time in Zambia and brought back a lot of art from there. So our house was kind of very well decorated with art from Africa and art from Kilkenny, the city where I grew up in, because it also has a quite vibrant art scene, which is amazing. So at some point in my life, I decided I wanted to be a photographer. And I think it almost, as well as being about art, I almost saw the camera as something that could take me places. I was very interested in travel and seeing the world, and photographers that were documenting the world and documenting other cultures were really interesting to me. And I thought if I became a photographer, I could travel the world and kind of do it that way. And I had some great teachers in my secondary school who really supported that, which was great. And a local photographer, Claire Dunn, who really helped me on my journey to get into uni. So I had great people around me supporting me, which is really, I look back now and think that I was very lucky, given that the arts wasn't, a huge part of my family, and it was a real unknown territory and profession to go into. So I'm really grateful for their support. But yeah, photography became the first kind of thing I latched onto.
And then you actually decided to study at undergraduate level photography in Dublin. Was that at Trinity College or University College or another institute?
It was actually at what's called now Technology University Dublin.
That's interesting. It's interesting, isn't it, in terms of the history of photography? Because I'm always telling my now very young students, who were babies at the start of the millennium, that Thomas Struth, Gursky, these didn't photography, art which happens to be photography was very difficult before we had the digital revolution and people could create photographic images that can compete with paintings for what we call wall power, if you like. So that's quite interesting that course was so was it quite technical? What did you learn from it?
Yeah, it was quite technical. There was only really 2 BA photography courses in Dublin at the time. So it was a choice of between IDT, which was a small kind of arts university in Dún Laoghaire, and this course with DIT at the time. But it was really well placed. So it was above the National Photographic Archive. So it was only the photography course that was placed there, and it was beside the Gallery of Photography. So really linked with these 2 important institutions in Dublin at the time. So it was the ideal dream place to be, really, and that's exactly where I wanted to go. And it was a 4-year BA course, so quite intensive, really. And we did a lot of the first 2 years were really focused on film. So a lot of developing work, a lot of camera work, a lot of work with Hasselblads, which was just as you can imagine, as at that age, you were just like incredible. A lot of 5/4 work we even did. So I'm really grateful of all the technical skills I learned at that time, but also it got me into curatorial practice because it was so linked with the gallery photography. We got to work a lot with the curators there. We had a full curatorial module across our 3rd year with a curator called Valerie Connor, who was hugely influential to me and still is, which is amazing. And she was one of the leading kind of practitioners in the curatorial scene in Ireland at the time. And yeah, that kind of got me on my journey towards a more curatorial profession. I did some curating of exhibitions in my 3rd year, started like an artist collective with some other students from different courses. So we did, a lot in Dublin at the time when we didn't have much money. So, the classic, we did lots of like guerrilla pop-up exhibitions where we just pasted walls with photographs, lots of fun things like taking over shops and putting on exhibitions. And that kind of got me to think about more, art as a conversation and working with other artists and not just working in my own siloed practice. And that kind of moved me to then straight away after graduating want to go on and study curating as a master's. Yeah.
Fantastic. And were you practicing both analog and digital photography?
Yeah. So we did both. So yeah, we did a lot of digital then 3rd and 4th year. We had a lot of really quite up-to-date technology at the time. And it was in the age where not everyone was using Photoshop. So we got to do a lot of work with that, produce quite big prints, work a lot with different print houses in Dublin, which was amazing. But personally, I like to stay on the film side. So I remain kind of a love of analog still, and did a lot of developing quite big work, which was great.
What was your first camera? Do you remember that? Was it when you were a kid or?
When I was a kid, what was my first camera? I had, if I think back to my very first camera, which is quite cheesy, was a little camera that reacted to a doll that I had called Susie Snapshot. When I was about 5. But no, my first camera was actually the first kind of digital SLR that I could afford, which was a Sony Alpha, which wasn't, was not great in any state or form, but it was an SLR, and it was amazing to me at the time.
Yeah, because I remember when I was a kid, I had a Kodak Brownie.
Yes.
Black and white film in, and I took pictures when we used to visit Spain and Italy and so on. I don't know if I've even got any of them anymore, little black and white pictures, obviously. And then I remember when I was doing my research in Pompeii and Herculaneum, I had like an Olympus OM10. This is pre-digital. So the only way I could record these wall paintings was I used to take prints and color slides because you never knew whether you were only really allowed into these places. You couldn't go back to them, for the research because they were close to the public. So it was really difficult. If it didn't come out properly, you'd have to ask, can I go back and re-photograph? And I don't, a lot of the listeners will be of, your generation and younger, and they will never have had to suffer that problem. And the other day we had to move offices in the Institute, and I had a whole cupboard of transparencies. And I didn't know what to do with them. And I thought, look, I'm never going to use these again. I really don't know what to do with them. But with a heavy heart, I just threw them away.
Oh my God.
Made probably a couple of thousand colour slides, which of course we used to use for our lectures. Hence PowerPoint, still talking slides.
Yeah.
So,
well, when I was in secondary school, I got a Konica Minolta, which was the first film camera. And that was amazing. And yeah, my poor parents still suffer in storing all my film that I've taken over the years at home.
Takes up a lot of space.
It takes a lot of space, and I have a dark room still at home. But so yeah, they do a lot.
So having got really immersed in photography and its techniques and displaying the idea of curating art and the dialogue with the public through maybe mainly photographic art, I think, did you then move to London? Because I think you then did a course at the Sotheby's Institute in Chinese Contemporary Art, maybe with Katie.
So that was actually afterwards. So I moved first to Falmouth to do my MA.
Oh, then you went to Falmouth. Then
I went straight to Falmouth. Yeah.
And for the listeners, Falmouth is in the south coast of Cornwall, in the southwest.
Yeah, quite far down, close quite to St Ives. If you want.
Exactly. We take our students to St Ives at the moment every year to do curating and to visit taters. So Falmouth is on the other side.
It's on the other side, exactly.
That's right. And in fact, my previous guest was he went to university, Jack, the
Yes,
big
of
painter.
course.
He went to university at Falmouth to study fine art,
Yeah.
and in fact, I've got paintings from St Ives where that everyone seems to study in Falmouth, you know, and it can be textile embroideries, all sorts of arts. It sounds like a wonderful place.
Yeah.
So
It
do you
was,
want to talk
yeah.
about maybe say a little bit about the experience of? Oh no, you went to Falmouth next, and you did a master's degree. Is that right?
Yeah, I did my master's in curatorial practice,
That's it.
which is a course that's sadly not running now anymore in Falmouth. But at the time, it was a really good critical course. It was quite low in numbers, so I think my course had about 8 students on it,
Wow.
which was very interesting to me because it was a really lot of you got a lot of one-to-one tutorial time, which was really good. And at the time, the course was run by Virginia Button, who was curator of the Turner Prize for many years, a great curator and writer. And the course was very linked with St. Ives, so with the Tate. We had a couple of live projects we did with them, so that was really amazing on a practical level to get to work with Tate, which I don't think sometimes those opportunities don't come unless you're in that small location. We were the only 8 curators learning at the time, looking for experience and really keen to get involved. So the opportunities were there for us, which were amazing. And then also curated a show at Newlyn Art Gallery, which is in Penzance, so quite further down, which is also quite an important contemporary art gallery there as well. So yeah, it was a really amazing course, but also, as you mentioned, there was such a hub of artists and of energies there at the time from across all the other courses, and all really contained together. And again, got to work, set up an artist collective again with some other students, got to do lots of different live projects across music and art, which is interesting as well. And we're very lucky to have a lot of really great guest lecturers. Did a lot with Charles Esch, the curator, as well. So it was a really, I would say, a really steep learning curve for me, but I learned so much from it. And I think it really set me up in quite a practical way as well to be able to work on a curatorial level. Yeah.
So it wasn't just like theoretical curating. There was a lot of logistical.
There was a lot of logistical stuff, which at the time I remember feeling, wondering, how it was beneficial. We had a show at Newlyn where I had an artist who had a lot of digital projection work, and I ended up doing a lot of technical work to install the whole thing. And, you're kind of thinking, oh, what is the point of this? But it all really stood to me. It was incredible. We did have a lot of the theory side as well. We were really pushed in that side. My MA project was a thesis, and that's kind of what I wanted to focus on. But it was great to get the practical elements. And as I say, working with Tate, doing, presentations to the director there on, proposed exhibitions that we would do in the space, but also learning a lot about engagement, which kind of has stood to me throughout my career as well, and how, presenting work to a particular audience and really thinking of context, and that kind of thing. So, I would say practically it really set me up quite well for my career.
Yeah, and again, another kind of seaside.
Yeah, exactly.
And
Yeah.
after which, you need to fill in the details of this, but I think the next kind of big thing, as it were, is you moved to London and are working at the photography gallery. So can you explain how that came about?
Sure. So graduated and then moved to London to be in the heart of it. During my MA, my thesis was kind of looking at the necessity of the specialist photographic gallery and looking at that kind of boundary between where photography fits in contemporary art. And I was lucky enough to actually spend some time with Brett Rogers, who was director of the Photographers Gallery at the time. And she helped me a lot with my thesis and interviewed me. So hugely generous with her time to me. So when I moved to London, that's the kind of space I really wanted to be in, this kind of mix of photography and curation. And I was lucky enough to get some work there, just as a visitor assistant to begin with, leading tours, but really nice to be kind of on the ground and like hearing what was happening and being amongst all that. But I was only there for a short time, about 8 months. And I got the opportunity to move to October Gallery, which was a more permanent role at the time. So that kind of shifted me in that direction then. Yeah.
And thinking about the October Gallery, my experience of it, it's a great gallery, and it represents a lot of African artists, I think, and I think at some point you also did a course in Chinese contemporary. So maybe you could say something about had you had you not experienced that kind of diversity of non-Western previously, and that's what you wanted to do, or had you and you just wanted to explore that further?
I think it was always a bit ingrained in me. As I mentioned, my mom always had an interest in art from the continent after having lived there. So that was always kind of in the background of my upbringing. But I hadn't really studied it a whole lot apart from personal research. So I had done had a lot of interest myself in artists from the African continent. So when I moved to October Gallery, that was a huge achievement for me. It was a place that was of interest to me. I'd always followed the work of big artists like Anatsui over the years. And so getting the job there was great. But, October Gallery, although it's most well known for representing artists from Africa, it really has an outlook of looking at artists across the non-Western. So it has a lot of really amazing artists from Asia, which I hadn't much experience in. So really starting to work at October Gallery first, working as assistant curator and then moving on to curator, I really wanted to expand my knowledge really. And Dr. Katie Hill, who's a great lecturer now at Sotheby's, was running the Chinese contemporary Chinese art in the market course, and she had brought lots of her students to visit some of the shows that I put on, and she really encouraged me to kind of develop in that direction. So I was very lucky to get on a course with her and learn a lot from her, because the history, I wanted to know the kind of, I was working with contemporary artists from China, like Qian Wei and Wan Huangzheng, who's a great curator as well. But to understand kind of the legacy of where they had come from, I really wanted to do. And that's kind of what I had the opportunity to learn on the course, and to understand the history of art throughout China and why it is where it is now. And the surgeons in the art market at the time when I did the course, Chinese art was really kind of to the heights of the markets and really had a lot of attention. So it was great to study how that came about. So that was, really beneficial.
Yeah, and listeners, well, you can look these up, obviously. Photographers' galleries, obviously, right in the middle of things near Oxford Circus, and the October Gallery is in a really interesting space near Russell Square. That's probably the nearest underground.
Yeah, exactly. It's kind of between Russell Square and Holborn. It's on Gloucester Street. But I mean, it was established in 1979. So really, it has a kind of long history of really wanting to be quite avant-garde and pushing artists that weren't really getting attention, and supporting artists that really weren't getting that support, and were maybe seen a bit as outsider art, or really had no backing in terms of like literature or where their art was being placed in a context. Apart from purely being saying that they were from a certain place. So it really has been quite a catalyst and quite a leading in pushing artists. Yeah,
I think it was the first place I took students, and we saw a lot of Anatsui, if I remember rightly. He's obviously now a household name, and British Museum, I remember them purchased one, and I think probably Tate and so on. So you, within 2 years, you'd become curator at October Gallery. Can you talk about how that happened?
Yeah, I mean, I was very lucky, I suppose, to work very closely with Elizabeth Lalushek, who's the artistic director there, who really was the kind of, and still is, an amazing curator in pushing these artists. So I got to work very closely with her. And I think the kind of experience I gained from my MA in curatorial practice, and really quite on the ground work, kind of helped me moving from assistant curator, and the curator at the time left and went back to the Netherlands, and it was an opportunity. And I think at the time Elizabeth gave me a chance to kind of do it on a temporary basis until the guys that maybe they hired someone else. So I jumped at that chance, and then got offered it as a permanent position afterwards, which was really, really great. And just got to work with some incredible artists.
What was that the first time you'd curate? You presumably then went on to curate shows very much from your own viewpoint, obviously maybe with a team. But could you talk? What was your first curatorial experience there, and could you want to talk about that?
Gosh, I'm trying to think of what my first show was.
Or just think of a favorite,
favorite one. Yeah. obviously working with Anatsui is amazing. Probably my favorite show was working with an artist called James Barnor. So got to know James Barnor's work, and at the time his work was really relatively unknown. James is a photographer from Ghana. He's now had a major retrospective a couple of years ago at Serpentine Gallery, which is amazing. But when I first met James, everything was, as you mentioned, slides and reels of film and negatives and everything were all in huge boxes around his very small room in London in sheltered accommodation. And I just was in awe at the images that he had made. He had a gallerist in Paris who was starting to get his work seen a little bit, but he was relatively unseen and unknown. So meeting him, I knew that he had a place at October Gallery, and that, you know, it would be great to show his work. But it was a huge project because a lot of his work wasn't scanned or it wasn't developed, so we had to spend a lot of time going through his archive and instantly just trying to preserve as much as we could. Some of his work sadly had got some damage to it, but we tried to do a lot of work with it. And so did a show with him and a photographer that sadly passed away, Daniele Tamagni, who's an Italian photographer who actually did quite a lot of digital contemporary work with the in the Congo, really looking at the Congolese men there and the way they dress, and the sapeurs of Congo, and so I curated this show with the dynamic of Daniele and then of James Barnor and the style he did in Ghana back in the 60s and 70s against the kind of more contemporary work of Daniele, with choosing these really vivid digital photographs of the sapeurs in Brazzaville in Congo. So that was quite an important show, and Brett came and opened the show, which was really great. And it was the first time that James got to have a lot of attention and got to show his work in a space like that. So that, I think that was in 2015 maybe, so that was quite an important show for me, definitely.
And that kind of exhibition material, now that's about 8 years ago. Now we've got like websites for galleries. I think galleries are archiving these exhibitions now. Would listeners be able to find that exhibition and see some of the images? Yes.
Yeah, I think they would. I think on October Gallery it would be possible to view that exhibition. I think if you go to James Barnor on our website, or Daniele, then you see the history and click on the specific show that we did at that time. So you should be able to see images of it, which is great. Yeah.
And again, it's something really recently has happened, that that when I was like your age, that, if you wanted to, if you heard about this artist called Andy Warhol, you had to find a book in a library, and that wasn't always easy. So it's just strange that now you can. I think my students often don't realize how lucky they are to be able to kind of access virtually anything that they want on the internet. And obviously it was a different kind of fun, and in some ways it made life easier, sort of the kind of whole analog world, but more in some ways more exciting. You had to travel and you had to look, and everything has really changed on that level. And so from October Gallery, your next move was to what you're now doing, which is to become the head of learning at the Delaware Gallery. So I know that was born in the 1930s and 1935 during, I guess by then, I'm thinking Virginia Woolf, like post World War I. I guess then we're pretty much into modernism as a cultural movement. And the building is a wonderful example of that modernism. I can never remember the name of the two architects, but I don't think they have like British sounding names.
It's Eric Mendelsohn and Sir Shamanoff.
That's it. Yeah, well, hopefully you would know their names, because presumably that comes into your teaching learning program. So I would imagine a lot of the listeners, including a lot of my current students who I know listen to podcasts and alumni, a lot of them probably haven't been to the Delaware Pavilion. So maybe you could say something about it and why they should go,
Yeah, of course. Yeah. I think the starting point is quite an iconic building, as you mentioned. So like really, it's almost seen as one of the first modernist buildings in the UK. So if people see pictures of it, probably what's quite recognizable is this huge cantilever staircase that's part of it. So lots of really streamlined shapes, quite industrial influence design as a building. As you mentioned, it was yeah, it's set up and it was built in 1935. The ninth Earl Delaware did a competition actually, which is quite interesting at the time, and advertised it in the Architectural Journal. So lots of different architects submitted different plans, and the kind of rough scope of the project was it had to have a kind of an entertainment hall, a restaurant, a reading room, and the architects that we mentioned won the design, really quite leading figures in the modernist movement as well, and built this huge building, which, as you can imagine, I mean, even now it feels like almost sticks out amongst the architecture of Bexhill. Bexhill is quite a small town placed kind of in between Hastings and Eastbourne, really seaside town. But this huge building was seen as to be kind of what we still like to live up to as being the People's Pavilion. So as being a space for health and well-being, for people to come together and experience art, culture, at the time reading as well, and over the years has almost had sport elements to it. But since about 2005, it has had funding from the Arts Council and has firmly established itself as a contemporary arts centre. We have 2 exhibition spaces. We have a huge auditorium where we have quite a big live program. So people like Kate Tempest and Flaming Lips have been there last year, this kind of performers. And then we have a great learning program. So it almost has a basis of being a cultural centre in the same way, to give people an example, as the Barbican. It has like this live element, this music element, but it also has a contemporary art gallery. And it also is just a kind of an amazing space to be in. We've got this incredible restaurant that looks right out over the seafront. We've got a rooftop space, which we do outdoor music on in the summer and outdoor events. We sometimes had sculptures there over the years. We have lots of outdoor sculptures sometimes. We just installed a large sculpture by an artist called Shabalala Self. So that's incredible. So there's kind of a lot of things going for it, but as you mentioned at the start, David, it's really right on the seafront. So it has this huge kind of view, and it's almost something we always have to, relate to that context whenever we're programming, because the sea is such a part, nearly almost, of the building. But yeah, really seen as a modern building, and we tried to show quite a range of really renowned contemporary international artists, but also some modern artists over the years. Yeah, I think that's kind of it in a nutshell. It's hard to know where to expand.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Just winding back a little bit in terms of so in terms of looking at this through an art business lens, as it were,
Sure.
My students would need to know this is, in terms of finance and the financing of the building, it's a charitable trust, so it's a not-for-profit.
Yes.
Yes. And then it relies on Arts Council money, which is coming from British taxpayers. But do you get any other kind of monetary funding coming in?
Yeah, so yeah, primarily we're an MPO, which is great. We got our MPO status again this year, which is brilliant. So a lot of money from the Arts Council, as you said. We also get funding from Rother District Council, which is our local council. Sure. But then we get smaller funds then for different specific projects. So for my program, I get a lot of funds for different groups that I work with. So I have a young refugee group of creatives, and that has a particular sum of money. We do arts and music work with adults with various neurodiversities and learning disabilities. We put on big events and concerts and do art exhibitions with them, and that has specific pools of money. And then we did a big schools project on equality, diversity, inclusion, and non-Western artists, and that had another pot of money. So things kind of come from different places, but primarily the core funding is Arts Council and Rother District Council. But this year we got to announce, which is really exciting for us, and you're going to see a lot of things coming from Delaware. Hopefully it'll get more and more on people's wavelength, and more people will visit, because we got awarded, Rother District Council got awarded 19 million for community creativity and skills from the Levelling Up Fund from LUF, and that will contribute to a lot of change in the Delaware Pavilion, which is hugely exciting for us. Yeah,
the Levelling Up programme, for listeners who maybe aren't aware of British politics, this this thing where the Tory government, they won a lot of seats in the north that is traditionally sort of socialist Labour voters. And but it's kind of on a promise that they would level up and they put more money, take money away from the south, and particularly London, the metropolis, and put it into non-south areas in particular. So it's good to see that you're profiting, if I may use that word, from that.
Yeah, of course, yeah. And it's great for us too, because it gets it's also working to build a creative hub in Sidley, which is a kind of a district of Bexhill, which is quite high deprivation and quite a disadvantaged community. But for us, we've always tried to be doing work out there, but we never really had a space, and now there's going to be a creative hub built there, which is going to be hugely beneficial for the area. So it's really exciting time for the Warr Pavilion in Bexhill. Yeah.
And it's part of a pattern, I would say, in the early millennium, where we had seaside towns that used to really thrive in the 1960s. I remember going to them myself when I was a kid. You know, you didn't go to Spain, and you didn't fly to Spain and Italy. It was far too expensive. Then suddenly, of course, in the 70s, probably you get cheap flights developing. A lot of those English seaside towns on the south coast, partly because of the weather, although they're incredibly charming, as I'm sure you'll agree, Dee. They really suffered socially and financially, economically.
Yeah.
And Margate and Folkestone, I'm thinking of in particular, the Folkestone Triennial Arts, and then of course Margate with the Turner Gallery. These are regeneration projects sort of focused on art events and art galleries. But what's interesting about Bexhill is that the Warr Pavilion obviously dates back pre all of that, 1930.
Yes. Yeah, it's true. But I think as you mentioned, as we all know, COVID has had a massive influence on lots of things. But I've really noticed it with St. Leonard's, where I live, and in Hastings and Bexhill as well, the influx of artists coming out of London and starting to work here, which I think will see a change and change in the ecology of the arts here as well. And you mentioned the kind of the big hitter of things that are happening, but really on a ground level, you can see a lot of things happening. There's lots of smaller little galleries that are opening up with really quite important work being shown, lots of events that are happening, lots of little art fairs that are happening. And I think it really will see that kind of shift over the years, that what's happening now, really. So lots of artists have come down and there's lots of more studios. Even with us in Bexhill, the Delaware was on its own for a long time on the artsy contemporary art scene. And now there's a really great space called Beeching Road Studios, which has about 20 artist studio spaces, a Flatlands Gallery. There's a ceramics studio, common clay, a bookbinding studio, and another artist, a whole studio taking over another industrial space in the old ambulance station. So there's all this kind of excitement happening, which is always great to see how that will develop as well. And of course, we have the Turner Prize is now coming to Towner in Eastbourne, which is very close to us in Bexhill. So there's going to be a lot of focus, I think, on the southeast coast here in the coming years. So I do really recommend anyone who's interested to kind of see places that are changing or things that are emerging to come and visit. It's quite exciting, I think, at the moment.
And that would fit in with hopefully most of the listeners will share a strategy, a personal strategy for sustainability,
Sure.
Removing your carbon footprint. So why not go on your holidays back to the south? Because we used to have
exactly.
A lot of these places still have these kind of slightly cheesy traditional sort of amusement arcades and and so on. But it is I think that you can still have a good time there, and obviously you can be unlucky with the weather, but that's changing as well. In the southeast, here are all these kind of exotic butterflies, and
Yeah, exactly. And I think also a lot of people can see kind of outside of London as maybe not being as diverse in terms of culture and population, but also in terms of the arts. But it's really interesting what's happening here at the moment. There's a really amazing exhibition at Hastings Contemporary at the moment called We Out Here. We also have an exhibition called Up in Arms, and it's really kind of looking at the diversity of artists that are working here and the diasporas that they're coming from and what they're commenting on. And I think, there has been a huge influx that we really acknowledge. We work quite quite closely with an organisation called the Buddy Refugee Project. And as I mentioned, setting up these groups called the Young Refugee Creatives. There's been a lot of influence and change in the diversity of the population here. And that's also quite interesting for the art scene, and the artists that are working and the work they're making is very different to what we probably would have imagined as seaside locations being maybe, 20, 30 years ago. Yeah.
And of course, it is in an area where there is the political debate. This is where refugees are coming across the Channel from France, bless them, and usually landing, I think, probably further east at Dover, Folkestone. But I'm sure that is part of discussion of in the pubs and in the cultural. But presumably, a lot of your artists, when you talk about diversity, are people growing up in the area, or are they moving out of places that like the conurbations like London and coming to places like Bexhill and Hastings, or is it a mix?
It's a total mix. It's a total mix, which is great. A lot of the young people who study quite locally stay because they can afford more to buy.
Come to London.
They can't afford to come to London, and as I said, it seems maybe in the last 5 years there's opportunities for them to be here. As I mentioned, these smaller galleries that are setting up, there's a chance for them to do stuff here which they wouldn't get to in London. But there is a real influx of people coming down from London who maybe have spent time away and are coming back to Hastings. So it's a total mix, but it seems like there's the kind of the foundation of the artists which have always been kind of around Hastings with this new kind of influx, and that's quite exciting. Yeah.
Is there a threat, as there sometimes is when these things happen, of gentrification and pricing out of artists who move there because it is an easy place to live and afford? Is that
definitely there's definitely those tensions. Particularly prices went up during pandemic time for rent.
Everyone, I could see that was a place I'd be looking. Let's second home.
Exactly.
Away from London. Yeah.
So
that's kind of issues as well.
Yeah, that is a real strain on the community, and that is a tension. But it feels a bit as it's leveling out a bit now, I suppose, with people returning to work. Commuting from Hastings is not something you would want to do every day. It's not as easy as Margate or Brighton. It is that bit longer. So the kind of the people that have moved here, the people who kind of want to stay, there is that seems to be that acknowledgement of the local communities and the want to kind of give back. But there was a couple of years of like really, classic cafes popping up and other local businesses then kind of doing worse. So you do have that tension, and it's an ongoing kind of argument of what is best. But it feels to be leveling out a bit. But it's difficult. Yeah, it's still
it's just sort of creating a balance. It's creating a balance, isn't it? And
trying to create a balance. Yeah, exactly. And it's trying to to kind of have that will that if people are coming here, that they're working here and that they're doing things that are part of the community, and they're acknowledging the communities that are here, which is hugely important. Because as I mentioned, there's a lot of deprivation in the outskirts. Even some of the young people I work with have never even been to the seaside, even though it's so close to them, and much less they have been to an institution like the Warr Pavilion. So we're really talking about people that are quite isolated, and it's the hope that the work that's happening will help them to get more integrated into their locality, but also into the arts, and hopefully provide opportunity and skills in that way. Yeah.
So as head of learning, presumably part of your mission is to make Warr Pavilion as welcoming as possible to anyone. Because we all know we all know about arts, that it's all very well for us who've grown up and love art, etc., and we're lucky maybe to come from families that took us to art and archaeology. But it's it can be quite difficult, I think, for people who haven't grown up in that to feel welcome, even into a museum. We all know museology, the British Museum with its big classical columns, forbidding place. But how does Warr sort of, as head of learning, how do you embrace as many people as possible?
Yeah, that's a really good point, because that's really the challenge. And we mentioned this great modernist building, but as I say, it really sticks out in the architecture of Bexhill, and it can seem like it's a space where maybe you're not supposed to be, or you don't know how to when you go in there. If you've never been to a gallery, and you know, there isn't, it's one of the biggest galleries in Southeast Coast, but if you haven't even been to Eastbourne or Hastings, then you won't have been to another space. So that's always the challenge. And you know, I'm quite proud that the exhibitions are always completely free at Warr Pavilion. So we never charge, which is amazing. And that's not, you know, that's not something that's a standard. So a lot of people can feel like they need money to instantly come in. Whereas the Pavilion, we're quite proud that we don't have to charge for exhibitions, and we do a lot of really free creative engagement work. We have, you know, our speciality is our art Sundays, where anyone can come in and just make an art session on the day and work with great local artists. So that's our biggest challenge, to get people into the building. But kind of how we work it is we have a great outdoor space as well, just right in front of the seaside. Between us and the seaside, there's these beautiful lawns. We have quite a lot of outdoor festivals that happen there, like I mentioned before. And we do lots in the summer, lots of our art activities outside. And then that kind of bridges the gap a bit. People come to those because guess what? They're okay with going to the seafront, and they know what's required of them when they go there. So they don't mind going onto the lawns and experiencing something. And then, you know, it bridges that gap of, oh, I've done that outside the pavilion, I don't mind going in and doing it. And it's quite important for us. You know, we're bringing quite big names. We had an amazing show last year by Zeneb Sadira, who obviously won a prize at Venice Biennale, and it's great for us to show her work to, you know, people who would never get to see, maybe never get to see contemporary artists like that. So it was amazing to be working with audiences that could have the opportunity to experience that and getting them in. And I suppose it's about, you know, working with interpretation and, you know, making sure that we make the work as accessible as possible for those who are, you know, coming down from London to see the work, but also for our communities around us. Yeah.
And I think sometimes it's really good when people meet the artists. I've always thought that's so important, because if an artist, you know, if an exhibition is curated by a living artist and then they're not there, I think that the works become somehow not for me, you know, forbidding. Whereas I think if you've got artists, as you sounds as though you do, like working with people on Sundays and so on, people realize these people are just like them.
Exactly.
You know?
Exactly.
And artists are, you know.
Yeah, exactly.
Sometimes we present it as this other thing, and it just isn't like that. Shouldn't be like that.
Exactly. Yeah.
How does your staff structure work? How many do you know? Can you give those figures of how many people are like full time in the pavilion?
Yeah. And I think a full-time, we have like across the whole board, we have about 70 people that work with us. 70, but say, wow. Yeah, but that crosses everything. That's the whole stewards, the cafe, all stuff like that. So we have huge teams. But maybe I could break it down. We have like three directors, director of operations and external relations, and our main director, Stuart Drew. And then we have programming teams, just to give people an idea of how these kind of structures work. So we have a head of live, a head of exhibitions, and a head of learning. And then from that, we have teams that work with us. So we all have about 3 to 5 people that work directly on our teams in sense of actually programming and setting up the program. But then it expands from that. We have a marketing team, finance team, fundraising team, and then all the team that work on the ground, our gallery assistants, our technicians. As I said, so we have a great shop which people love as well. We've got the whole gift shop, and we've got a huge box office team that do all the gigs. So that's kind of how we operate. But it while it may seem like a lot of staff, when it actually comes down to the programming side, we're quite on the ground and thin on who we have working. So we need to achieve quite a lot for what we do. Yeah. So
sounds as though you have to work quite hard, but very fulfilling. What I was going to ask as well is the cafe, the bookshop, the restaurant, are they outsourced or are they part of the?
They're all internal. So yes. All internally done, which is really interesting, because sometimes other organizations that's outsourced, but the cafe and the shop and everything is all part of the Delaware. So
and quite local as well, therefore, because somewhere like the National Gallery, you know, I think their cafes, restaurants are definitely outsourced and so on. So that can create problems in moving money from that into the charity, and you know. There you
Yeah.
go. It's lovely to know that it's actually all your own
It's
stuff.
all part of it, and that makes it quite nice, because then, you know, we get to work with the cafe team. If we have a specific artist that might have, you know, some kind of specific links to a specific food or drink, we get to
the themes
also as well. So it kind of yeah, I think it works quite well to give people a full experience when they come. Yeah.
And so what's the future, Dee? Like, just the immediate future this summer? I had a look at the website. I must come down, obviously, and see these shows. They look amazing. The listeners should look at the website. I will put the link on the podcast material. But this summer, anything particularly that you're looking forward to?
Yeah, I'm really looking forward. So we have Mohammed Sami is coming. So we have a huge painting show by Mohammed Sami. The works are coming from Camden Arts Centre. So some people might have seen some of the works there, but we're showing some unseen works as well. Getting to show them in quite a large space, which is amazing. And then also Katie Cudden, so a ceramicist in a way, originally from London. So we're getting to show her work. Lots of work that hasn't been unseen, a really new work that she's made, commenting a lot on kind of her experience as a mother and working at night and working at different times of day, and kind of the tension between objects and ceramics. So that's going to be super interesting as well, which is so really two really quite exciting shows. And then in the autumn time, we have a big show spanning across our two galleries by Helio Lucier, a Brazilian artist, which is really exciting.
Incredible diversity, and of course the one it reminds me of Tate St Ives, which is another gallery on the sea and much more recent, of course. Of course in summer the London art world closes down, particularly in August, whereas obviously you're doing quite a lot in places like St Ives, Falmouth and Bexhill, because there's a lot of seaside visitors coming down.
Exactly, that's our prime time. So our biggest spot is often in summer. However, with Turner Prize coming now in the autumn, it's going to be quite focused as well.
That's exciting, and I think everyone should make an effort. If listeners are thinking about visiting the Delaware at Bexhill, that might be a good time to go actually, when the Turner Prize will be down there. So that'd be really good. I think actually one last question, because I'm starting to post like video versions of these podcasts, and I'm sure that anyone watching the video will want to know what that amazing work is behind you. So maybe you could say a little bit about that.
This is a work by Lady Scully. I'm not sure if I mentioned it. So it's an artist from Cape Town. This is a work she did actually with Tyburn Gallery in London, which now isn't running. The director is working for Goodman Gallery actually. But it was a huge wall piece that she did, and it was influenced by the Khoisan cave paintings in South Africa. But Lady Scully is probably my favorite artist. This is a print of the wall sculpture that she did. And she now is an artist, which she has, she designed one of the coins for the South African currency. So quite a really interesting artist that looks a lot at gender and identity and kind of politics of lust and things like that. So yeah, she's kind of my icon behind me always, which is great.
And is it like some kind of primeval goddess?
So it's looking at a society that was quite matriarchal, where women were always quite in power. Around the kind of afro halo kind of in her head, you'll see all these kind of male figures that she's kind of holding close. But she and also the kind of the number of arms and stuff referred to these drawings, these really ancient drawings by the Khoisan people. But she also uses fruit, kind of quite phallic, kind of nods to different gender as well. So it's an amazing image. I wish I could see it more closely. But anyway, Dee, it remains for me to thank you very much for being a guest today. You certainly whetted my appetite to get down to the sea and great. To have a bit of culture as well, and I wish you well, and the pavilion well, and I think that your mission is amazing. It's diverse, it's inclusive, and wish you well, and I'm sure some of the listeners will come down and see the pavilion. So thank you very much for being a guest today. Absolute pleasure. Thank you, David.